Welcome to Resolving Reality, an independent Irish media platform. This is video episode 11, and I interview Jared Taylor about diversity, multiculturalism, and race. Jared is an author and an editor at the American Renaissance website amren.com. Support this channel, Resolving Reality, like, comment, share, and subscribe. And for all our other profiles and platforms, visit our website, resolvingreality.com. Okay, Jared, hello and welcome to Resolving Reality.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
No worries, great to speak to you. Well, I've been aware of your work for quite a few years now, and I know what you cover. But of course, we need to do some sort of an introduction here for anyone who's watching who's totally new to your work. So let's talk about the website first of all, American Renaissance, amren.com. And what is this website all about, and how did you get started?
It's all about what I call race realism and white advocacy. Race realism is the recognition that, unlike the fashionable view that race is some sort of sociological optical illusion, it's the recognition that race is a biological phenomenon and it's an important part of group and individual identity, and that the races are not interchangeable. White advocacy is a recognition that whites, like every other racial group, have legitimate interests that must be defended. And if we don't defend them, certainly no one else will.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and as well about your background as well, you did a lot of traveling, didn't you, when you were younger? You moved around quite a bit. Tell us a little bit about that, and did that contribute to your kind of understanding of these subjects?
I was born in Japan, where I lived until age 16. And most people assume that having grown up in a homogeneous society, that must have been a profound influence on my racial views and my appreciation for homogeneity. But it really did not have much of an influence. I was a conventional liberal and remained so until, well into my 30s, I would say. After leaving Japan, I lived in the United States for some years and then traveled in Europe and also in West Africa. And it is certainly true that traveling in West Africa gave me a more vivid sense that racial groups were different, that they were not all equivalent and interchangeable, which was my view as a young man, as a college student, and until I became more aware of perhaps the harsher realities of biological differences.
Mm-hmm. And, well, you know, speaking of Japan then, that was one of the first things I wanted to ask you. Why do you think that they have managed to kind of be so in control of their situation and their culture, despite everything that's happened in their country as well? What's the difference between them and the Western countries when it comes to this issue?
They're not white. It seems that every non-white country is able to maintain its cultural and national coherence. This willingness to give one's country away to people utterly unlike oneself, this seems to be an exclusively white or European disease. And so the Japanese, in that respect, are no different from the Mexicans or the Turks or the Vietnamese or the Bolivians. Those people would never accept the idea of their native populations or their current majorities being replaced or displaced by someone else. If you were to suggest to the Chinese, for example, that, you have a pretty good country here, but, just too damn many Chinese. You need more diversity. You could really ginger the place up with, a couple of million Pakistanis, and, Haitians are good for the mix, and, throw in a few Guatemalans, and your country would be vastly improved. They'd call for the men in the white coats. They'd put you in a padded cell. It's only in the West, only among white people, that kind of talk doesn't get you sent to the loony bin. This notion that somehow it is virtuous for us to become a minority. It's virtuous for us to open up our civilization, open up our homelands to people who are not only unlike us, but in many cases hate and despise us. This is a disease that is exclusive to us.
And this, I know you've given a lot of thought to this, and I'm sure you've had to, when we look at things like this from a pragmatic point of view, we want to know about the origins and where they came from. So, I mean, and I know you're dealing with similar challenges in the US as we are here in Ireland and other Western countries. It's slight variations on this ideology, but it all ultimately is about the same kind of thing at its core. So where do you think these ideologies have come from? The ones that seem to promote diversity and equality, but just have a double standard and don't promote white identity?
I honestly don't have a good answer for that question. I've been thinking about it for decades now, and there are various factors that contributed to it. I believe that the two world wars, the Great War, the First World War, was very, very demoralizing for Europeans. They thought, how could we, as a civilization, as a race, have plunged the world into such butchery? And then to have yet another world war, this fratricidal war of white people slaughtering each other, take place just a few years after. All this was very devastating to the morale of white people. There are people who think that Christianity, because of its universal avocation, it makes it impossible for whites to think in their own racial terms. There are people who blame excuse me, there are people who blame Jewish intellectuals, and there are a number of Jewish intellectuals who have been very much at the forefront in movements that are trying to undermine any sense of racial solidarity and legitimacy among whites. There are people who claim that simple modernity, the fact that we live so well, that life is not a struggle, this leads to a kind of mental sluggishness. There are people who claim that there's something about European people makes them individualistic and care only about their own families or their own personal gain. All of these things may have played a role, but even so, neither individually nor in combination do they explain to me what is something that is so contrary to normal natural instincts. Most people all around the world, so long as they're not white, do have a normal, natural, healthy sense of identification with their nation, with their group, with their language, with their religion, with their race. It is somehow we in the West who have had that natural identification beaten out of us. And now the elites throughout the West, and in almost all white countries, except for some of those that were protected by what we used to ironically call the Iron Curtain, wherever you go among white majority nations, our elites, our rulers, our opinion molders, they're all telling us that we should not think in racial terms, that we should in fact ultimately bow out and off the stage of history and give our countries to people from other countries, other races, other religions. This is a very, very recent sickness among whites. 60, 70, 80 years ago, this would have been unthinkable, but now it's near universal. And again, I don't have a satisfactory explanation for why this disease has come upon us in such a serious and potentially suicidal way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what happened with me, Jared, was that my traveling to living in Australia and in the UK helped me notice this stuff. It became more obvious because it's the same opinions, the media is acting the same way, and academia is producing the same narratives in all these countries. And even if we look what's happening in South Africa as well, I know it's quite a complex history, but all of it seems to be following the same pattern, that you have certain groups are allowed to have victim status and others are not allowed to have this status, and that seems to kind of drive this thing forward. It's quite emotional,
It's very emotional. And again, as you point out, all of these things are described using exactly the same terms and with exactly the same objectives in mind, to delegitimize any sense that whites may have that they have group interests that must be defended, any idea that they have a culture, a heritage, and a destiny that is uniquely theirs, any idea that it is perfectly proper and right for them to have territories that belong only to them, where they can be allowed to let their destinies unfold. the whole system of terminology, of appeals to guilt, appeals to a twisted sort of virtue, they're all the same wherever you go. And at the same time, of course, I've done a reasonable amount of traveling in Europe, and I know South Africans. I don't really know anyone in Australia or New Zealand, but I suspect it's the same there, that the way we are resisting this, the kind of people who realize what is at stake, the kind of people who see the crisis are very much the same. And they see the threat in similar terms. There is a real worldwide brotherhood of Europeans in the sense of people like you and me and people throughout Europe who understand why, or certainly understand what is happening and what we must do in order to survive as a people and as a culture. So yes, there's an astonishing sort of uniformity, whether it's a country like Sweden that never had colonies, a country, or slavery for that matter, or a country like the United States that never had colonies but did have slavery, or France or Britain or Spain, which did have extensive colonies, or even a place like Switzerland, to which none of those factors apply. Simply being European or of European extraction, that seems to be, except for Eastern European countries, all it takes for us to fall victim to this ultimately suicidal state of mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on that point, even somewhere like Ireland, which is, this small country, the edge of Europe, and we were mostly, under the rule of the British Empire for such a long time, and that didn't really stop officially till, say 1949 with the British monarch, releasing their grip kind of, and even here, they're still peddling the same agenda, but they can't bring out that colonialism weapon with us. They can't say it's because we've got a colonial past, but they will still push it anyway. They just won't do it in the same way. Kind of, it's a slight variation on the tactic.
Yes. Why? What is it about Ireland's history that makes it susceptible to this kind of guilt-mongering? It's very difficult to say. As you say, Ireland was in fact colonized and brutalized, some would say, by the English. It has no apologies to make to the Third World, and yet there are strong voices within Ireland that say, oh yes, we must become multicultural too. We must become diverse. Fortunately, that process has not gone so far in your country. You can still, even in a place like Dublin, I find it pleasantly white, certainly compared to New York City or Chicago or London or Paris. But the mentality is the same. And the processes, all the same processes of dispossession are at work in Ireland just as they are in the rest of Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that what I noticed when I said about people having the same kind of opinions wherever I go, they're spouting the same ideologies, talking about the same things like diversity and multiculturalism. I think the universities and academia have a big role to play. It's like the state, media and academia are kind of working together to condition people, even in somewhere like Ireland, where you would think people had a very strong nationalist identity who want to be free, have been completely brainwashed into thinking that, oh, you know what, none of that matters anymore. Now we have to be like everyone else. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, the universities certainly do play a huge role in all of this, but that just pushes the question back one step further. How did the universities come to be dominated by this kind of suicidal thinking? And they're all the processes that I described earlier, and they play some sort of role. But none of this really, to me, is a satisfactory explanation. Throughout history, throughout millennia, it has been impossible to persuade people simply to disappear or to withdraw from places where they were a majority, where they had the power to remain a majority. Ancient tribes You couldn't walk up to one group and say, well, you should practice diversity. You should let us into your hunting grounds. And if we become a majority, then you should gracefully withdraw. That never happened. Never, never. The people who had the hunting grounds, and if they had the power to keep others out, they did so, and they made no apologies for it. Here we are, the most powerful, innovative, and dynamic people, really, in the history of the world. We have suddenly lost our nerve. And over just a past half century or so, we have become people who act as if we have no right to continue to exist. Again, fortunately, the people who were on the other side of the communist divide, and I think that was really their salvation. Many of them still have a healthy sense of who they are. The Hungarians, for example, the Estonians, or the Lithuanians, they realize that they have countries that reflect their own particular genius, and they want to stay that way. The Poles, or the Czechs, the Slovaks, they are all more or less still healthy. But those of us who have lived in the West, we have become prisoners of this whole set of ideological poisons that seem to have washed away any kind of healthy sense of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I find it amazing when you look at Europe, the Polish, their attitude towards migration is very different to the rest. And maybe it's that because they were living under communism for so long, right up until the Berlin Wall came down, I suppose you could say that it's so fresh in their minds about not having any sort of autonomous control. And because it was so recent and they're still trying to get on their feet economically, they like their freedom now and they like their independence and whatever independence they have, and they don't want to jeopardize it. Maybe that's why their attitude is different.
I've thought about why the Eastern Europeans are different. And I think the main reason is that up until 1989 or so, they simply weren't exposed to all of this whooping about diversity and how wonderful it all is, and how having blacks or Mexicans or Muslims in your society is ultimately a wonderful thing. They just never had to deal with any of that. Another is that they lived under outright censorship. They have a very healthy skepticism of what the newspapers are telling them. I think increasingly in the West, more people are waking up to the systematic bias in the major news media. But for those who grew up under communism, under a system in which the media were controlled, obviously and clearly and transparently by people with a political agenda, they're more used to thinking for themselves, perhaps. But still, the explanation for me, that really is screaming to be made is not why the Eastern Europeans are healthy. All people should be healthy. The real explanation screaming to be made is why we are so sick. And as I say, it's a great good fortune that at least we have models of European societies, white majority societies, that have not succumbed to this multiculti madness. And as time goes on, as in the West, as the French or the Germans, if they really do continue to fill their countries up with people who hate them, the contrast will become more and more marked. And I hope that contrast will give impetus to the nationalist movements that we see growing throughout Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I didn't think of that with Poland, that because they were under communism, they didn't have the same, sophisticated Western education systems kind of pumping this trash into their minds. And that's an interesting take on it for sure. Makes a lot of sense. And
I must say, though, that I was in Estonia, just a few months ago. And in my hotel room, I was watching BBC television. And BBC television is, as I'm sure you're aware, it is just as multiculti as it's about possible to be, always celebrating multi this and multi that. They even have their very own LGBTQ correspondent who is a black fellow who reports on all the wonderful things that homosexuals and transvestites and all those people are doing throughout the world. And this message is being constantly beamed into all of these countries that still have a modicum of good health. The question to me is whether the Eastern Europeans, who are clearly not as wealthy as we, will they be able to resist these blandishments? Because the West is still the source of everything that is trendy and modern and wealthy and glitzy and fashionable, often outright degenerate. But even in its degeneracy, the West has a certain appeal in certain elements. So it's almost a race between whether or not the Eastern Europeans, while preserving their racial and cultural coherence, can catch up economically to the West to the point where they can say, well, this multi-culti stuff has nothing to do with being wealthy. In fact, it's really a drag on those economies. Whether they can become economically our equals before they succumb to all of these temptations that seem to link multiculturalism or multiracialism to the glossy, apparent success of Western European societies. And I think that there is a good chance that the Eastern Europeans will hold out. The Western Europeans, of course, are urging them in the fiercest possible terms to become multicultural, multiracial. Angela Merkel wants to spread her darling pets, all of her wonderful Muslims all around Europe. But to their credit, the Eastern Europeans are saying, no, we like our countries the way they are, and we're not going to change. As I say, I don't know how long that resolve will last. But at the same time, when it's joined with the fact that, in the coming European Union elections in March, it's predicted that these so-called right-wing, but I think I would simply call them more nationalist parties, they're likely to do well. They're likely to help change the kind of political dialogue that goes on in the West. If we see the sorts of changes that are predicted, then just as the Eastern Europeans are asserting their nationalism, Western Europeans may be in the process of resurrecting and rekindling a healthier nationalism of their own. I hope that's the case.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting as well, Jared, that it's kind of a race against the clock, because when we look at what's happening in Sweden, who are quite far down this road, them and Germany are quite advanced in this plan, and they're really suffering because of that. You look at the voting patterns, because of the migrants coming in will generally tend to band together and vote for those who look after their interests. So there becomes that almost like a tipping point where so many come in, and then that itself will start to add more momentum to the whole movement, and then any chances of kind of rectifying all this start to disappear because the demographics of the population are changing.
Oh, I think the United States is perhaps the best possible example of this. If we set aside for the moment South Africa, where, of course, it was a terrible mistake to hand the country over to black rule. But here in the United States, whites are only maybe 62, 63% of the population. And every election, the proportion of the electorate that is white declines. And for example, if we were to take the semi-miraculous election of Donald Trump in 2016, if the American electorate voted in racial proportions exactly as it did in 2016, in the next election in 2020, because there are fewer whites and there are more non-whites, Donald Trump will lose. This is something that's gone on since the election of Lyndon Johnson. I believe that was in 1964. That is the last time that we got a Democrat president for whom a majority of whites voted. What this means is that every Democrat president since then is not the president that whites wanted. They were voted, they won with a minority of the white vote, but with an overwhelming majority of the non-white vote, to the point that the preferences of whites were canceled out. And it's now at the point where you can win close to 60% of the white vote, 60-40. Back in the old days when the country was overwhelmingly white, a 60-40 election would have been considered an overwhelming landslide victory. But you can win 60% of the white vote and perhaps still lose in the United States because of this dramatic democratic shift. And it is in democratic countries where there is this one man, one vote system where demography truly is destiny. There are Middle Eastern countries, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. They import large numbers of non-citizens to work in their construction industries and in their other labor requiring areas, sectors of the economy, but they don't give them voting rights. They don't make them citizens. And so demography does not have the same dramatic political and cultural and other kinds of impacts on those countries that it does in, for example, the United States.
Yeah, and it's interesting with the state. The states as well have been, always been somewhat of an ethnic mix, but not as maybe dramatic as it is now. Of course, not as the way it is now. But at what point do you think was it back then to do with the presidency and government in the 60s or 70s that things started to change and there was this push to change the demographics, or at what point did this happen?
Up until 1965, the United States had a immigration policy that was designed specifically to keep the country majority white. Immigration from Africa, for example, or from Asia, was very, very limited by law. In 1964, however, the year before that, we passed something called the Civil Rights Act that made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race for private employment or for accommodation. Up until 1964 in the United States, it was legal, at least in certain states in the South, to hire only a black or a white workforce, if that's what you wanted. It was legal not to serve blacks in your restaurant, if that's what you wanted to do. However, discrimination of that kind by public utilities or by monopolies was forbidden. In other words, the electric company had to sell electricity to anyone who was prepared to pay. But private operators, private actors could discriminate. That was changed in 1964. And the thinking was likewise, well, we have this racially discriminatory immigration policy. We'd better change that too while we're at it. But this change in the law was pushed as something that would be primarily cosmetic. People like Robert Kennedy, who were sponsoring this law, promised that it would not result in large-scale immigration, certainly nothing that would change the ethnic balance of the United States. Well, whether that was a lie, whether they actually believed what they're saying, I don't know. But the result was a tremendous change. At that point, 1964-65, the United States was about 90% white and the rest were blacks. If you had told Congress that, well, in about 70 years' time, 75 years' time, if we change our immigration policy, whites are going to be reduced to a minority, I can assure you that Congress would not have voted such a law. The American people never said, even through their representatives, and much less through any kind of direct participatory democracy, they never said, oh, how nice, we'll become a minority. No, this has been foisted upon us by indirection, and sometimes, I believe, through actual deception. But the changes took place, the very important changes took place in the 1960s. I believe, for example, that if I am a private business operator, it should be entirely my right to serve or not serve whomever I wish to serve or not serve. If I want to have customers who are only left-handed, red-headed, Irish origin duck hunters, that should be my right. But no, the state now says, no, you may not decide. To me, that is as intrusive as the government telling me that I can't make up my own mind about whom I might wish to marry. These should be individual choices left up to each of us. But Americans lost that right in 1964, and the United States voluntarily gave up the right to discriminate in terms of race and national origin in terms of its immigration policy in 1965.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think that sometimes it sounds obvious, but there is that farcical element to democracy, where they will, what you're talking about there pretty much is totalitarianism in a way, but they can't be so overt about it. They need to hide it sometimes when they want to be in control, and they will allow voting for certain things, but not other things. So certain elements of the progressive agenda, like, feminism, abortion, things like that, which are relatively new in Ireland, there have been some, and of course the LGBTQ agenda, with the gay marriage referendum, there have been certain things that have been allowed to be voted on by the general public, but other things like, changing the genetic makeup of the country, that would never fly. So I don't think they'd even bother with stuff like that,
Ultimately, of course, in a democracy where in Ireland or in the United States, we are supposed to be able to choose our rulers, and to some extent we can. It would not be impossible to elect people who were willing to defend our interests. And we see this increasingly happening in some of the Western European countries. Italy now has this, what used to be called the Northern League, but now it's just known as the League. Interior Minister Matteo Salvini. Mm-hmm. He represents a newly awakened Italian electorate that says, no. We don't want to let in these migrants. And Salvini, he's really made rather a name for himself. He was talking about how all of these people want to cross the Mediterranean, come to Italy. Well, the only Italy they're ever going to see is on a postcard. And he was boasting just the other day that now Italy's got to the point where they're sending back more of these migrants that are coming in, so that there is a net diminution in these people coming from North Africa. He clearly wants Italy to remain Italian. So the democratic process is not completely falsified, and the same is true in Hungary, for example, where Viktor Orban he's been in office now, I think, for 10 years. The people, under certain circumstances, can elect people that are going to represent their desires. In the United States, at any rate, and I suspect it's probably true in Ireland, the media, in some, they could be described as actually more powerful than government, because they set the tone of acceptable discourse. And at the same time, in the American political system, we have this two-party system. It's not like Italy, for example, where this part of the ruling coalition, now the Five Star Movement, that party is only 3 or 4 years old? It's unthinkable in the United States to have an upstart new party that could then find itself in power. Whereas this kind of thing happens relatively frequently in parliamentary systems. I believe you have more of a parliamentary system in Ireland, so it's possible that you could have new parties that would reflect the genuine will of the people. We are stuck with these Republicans and these Democrats that do not, for the most part, have clear-cut litmus tests for ideology, but they both subscribe very wholeheartedly to the idea that America is basically a country that's up for grabs, and it would be immoral to say that Americans must meet a certain religious or linguistic or racial profile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like a 2-horse race over there, kind of, in a way. And here we have the rising up of a few nationalist parties. They're trying to gain some traction, and really the bigger parties here, they all have Irish names, but they're globalist. There's Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and Sinn Féin, which is the political wing of the IRA, the Republican Army, but they've got a Marxist component, and in fact, really, all of them are kind of Marxist. So all the bigger parties here are really on board with the globalist thing, and there's no opposition. So there's no opposition like in any sort of a parliamentary system, but the hope lies with the Nationalist Party. So I think the question really is, will enough people in Ireland be able to wake up to this and start to back those newer parties? That's the only way around it, I think.
Yes, and where you do have a parliamentary system with far more options for the voters, this is a more promising course of action. Of course, in Ireland as well, you're battling against mainstream media that are completely sold on the idea of globalism, as you call it, who would never dare defend Ireland in terms of its biological roots, of its heritage in a certain people. They would consider this racist, neo-Nazi, white supremacist. All of the major media in the West are in the hands of people who think in those terms. But ultimately, I believe that even in the United States, if in the privacy of the voting booth, whites had an opportunity to vote for someone who said, look, whites have legitimate interests. We don't want to become a minority. It's not as though we dislike other people, but we have a certain society and we have the right to preserve the characteristics of that society. Such a person would gain a great deal of electoral support. And I suspect that although Donald Trump never spoke explicitly in terms of the demographic future and of preserving the rights of whites as a majority, I don't doubt that a great number of people, hard to say exactly how many, voted for him in the vague sense that he would stand up for white people. So when they do have an opportunity to express themselves, whites will act, so long as they can do it anonymously. It's just that the game is certainly rigged in the United States, and it is rigged in Western Europe as well. But I think it's less rigged there because you have a system that's more fluid, more open to new parties, new ideologies. You've had ideologies across the spectrum. You had communists running. You had socialists running. In France, you had monarchists running for office. You had a real choice that is denied the American voter. And I believe it's denied the British voter too. All of us English-speaking countries who are sort of stuck in this sort of really rather narrow band of political opportunities and political possibilities. But I'm very encouraged by the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, by the Freedom Party in Austria, by the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, by the Danish People's Party. All of these groups reflect a genuine yearning on the part of ordinary Europeans to preserve the country that they inherited from their ancestors so that they can deliver it intact to their descendants. And this is what democracy is supposed to do. It's supposed to reflect the genuine desires of the people. That there are many, many ways, as you suggested already, to deflect and divert and thwart the desires of the people. But if enough people wake up to the crisis they face, then our elites, no matter how hard they try, will find it very, very difficult to thwart us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the masses, well, a section of the masses being under a spell. And that spell is, if that's broken, then there's a chance. But unfortunately, maybe with a lot of these things, people need to understand why this is all a bad thing, and they need to re-look at all of this and kind of wake up and realize that this diversity and multiculturalism stuff is not in their interests. And there's many here who have to wake up to that, I think. And as well, looking at the I remember reading an article on the Ameren website about what's happening at the border in the States. You know, you've got, I think there was a militia was arrested because they were trying to stop migrants coming into the country. So it's tell us about that. Is it really down to the people now in some situations to stop this change happening?
This is not the first time that American civilians have showed up on the border with weapons and detained people who are coming across. There's some legal ambiguity as to whether or not they have the right to do so. There is such a thing as citizen's arrest. Now, to what extent it's legal for people to show up with arms, and in some states, the open carrying of firearms is legal. To what extent it's legal to show up and then catch people who are coming in illegally, hold them at gunpoint until the Border Patrol comes and turn them over. That's something I frankly don't know whether or not it's entirely legal. I suspect that under certain circumstances it is. But given the prevailing views, certainly among the mainstream media, this is considered a hideous and racist and potentially murderous intervention in the affairs of government. To what extent that can be useful and effective, I don't honestly know. I'm not in touch with any of the people who are involved in those groups. One of the earlier groups was called the Minutemen, and the Minutemen got its name from the colonial era men who were prepared on 1 minute's notice, presumably, to leap out of bed and grab their weapon and go fight the British Redcoats. But the Minutemen, they were armed men who were prepared to defend their country. This is likely to be only a small movement. I don't think that you're going to have hundreds or thousands of armed citizens on the border doing the job the Border Patrol is not going to do. But this is an expression of the desperation of some people who've given up hope in the capacity and the willingness of their government to enforce the nation's laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting, and like, because you've got is it the Third or Fourth Amendment? Excuse my ignorance about the right to bear arms in an organised militia. But like you said, doing anything else on top of that may kind of get themselves into trouble and is actually illegal in the end.
It's the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms, and there are people who argue that that right is an individual right. There are others who argue that because the word militia, organized militia, is in the amendment, that it is only in the context of taking part in some sort of organized state or local militia that Americans have the right to bear arms. So far, the Supreme Court has generally ruled that it is an individual right, and you don't have to be a member of a militia. But then there are regulations as to what you can do with those arms. Whom do you have the right to hold at gunpoint, for example? In Virginia, where I live, ours is an open carry state. You can openly carry a firearm if you have the legal right to own a firearm. And if you see, if you have a genuine reason to believe that your life is in danger, you can then use your firearm on someone. Likewise, if you see someone else and you have a genuine belief that that person's life is in danger at the hands of an armed assailant, you have the right to shoot that assailant. Now, to what extent you have the right to hold someone at gunpoint who may or may not have committed a crime, and also the question when it comes to Border Patrol, that is generally a federal responsibility, not a state responsibility. So I believe there's something of a gray area as to the extent to which private citizens can pull guns on people that they think are illegal immigrants and hold them under threat of death until the Border Patrol shows up. Again, I suspect that is not illegal, but depending on the state, depending on the governor, depending on what sort of what the ideological atmosphere of the surrounding area would be, that'd be frowned upon or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't have that culture here, so of course things are different. There's no real weapons in Western Europe held by the general public, and I'm not saying that would be a great idea, but it does bear some thought about the idea of having governments forcing their agendas on people and them physically not being able to do anything about it, like we have in France with the yellow vests. When they want to go out and initiate change, it gets aggressive to the point where people start getting shot. And in that situation, it's the state doing the shooting and not the other way around. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yes, it is. There is an enormous amount of dissatisfaction throughout the Western world. And the United States is probably more divided than at any time since before the Civil War. I believe that it is essentially this question of race that is dividing the United States. The Democratic Party is increasingly positioning itself as the one that represents women, minorities, immigrants, homosexuals, and the Republican Party is essentially, whether it likes it or not, whether it admits it or not, is becoming the party that represents white people. Now, to me, it is a terrible form of politics when you have a multiracial society in which candidates simply vote for someone who is the same race as themselves. A political contest is supposed to be about finding the best way to govern a nation for the interests of all. In a multiracial nation, when you have candidates of different races, and you simply vote for the candidate of the same race, the whole political game becomes one of splitting up the country along racial interest lines. I'll vote for the black guy because I'm black and I think he'll be good for black people. Or I'll vote for the Hispanic because I'm Hispanic. This is the worst sort of politics. It inevitably drives a country to just increasing levels of dissension and division. It's the kind of thing that ultimately in Lebanon led to civil war. You had Muslims, you had Christians, you had Maronites, all voting in an explicitly religiously oriented and sometimes tribally oriented way that culminated in civil war. But multiracialism, I believe, inevitably breaks down along racial lines. Race is the most salient and difficult fault line in any society, more so than economic differences, more so than religious or linguistic differences, because race is a biological phenomenon. It can't be changed. You can learn how to speak English and sound utterly like an American who's been here for 200 years, but if you are Black, you are still Black. And often Black people will still identify primarily as Black and not as American. Same thing with Hispanics, to a lesser degree with Asians. So this idea of building a multiracial society in which race can be made not to matter is a complete illusion. And no society should ever attempt to undertake such a ridiculous and futile program.
Yeah, it's interesting that the connection between the postmodernist stuff that I think the universities, again, to come back to the universities, what they're peddling is that, you know, they tries to deny reality almost. So, for example, with the LGBTQ thing, gender is a social construct. It's no basis in reality. This is just how you're perceiving reality. And do you think that's fair to say they're trying to do that with the race thing, that they're trying to say that's a social construct even? The only way race is real is the color of the skin. The rest is just in your mind, kind of.
Oh, it started with race, the idea that race is a social construct. We've been hearing that for long before we started hearing that sex is a social construct. But most people are getting quite sick of it now. The idea that you look at a Congo pygmy and compare that to a Dane, and the differences that you see are some kind of sociological optical illusion. I mean, as I like to say, that idea is so wrong and so stupid that only very intelligent people could possibly persuade themselves that it's true. And the same with sex. I mean, for heaven's sake, you're born, except for very, very strange and rare hermaphroditic conditions, you're born one sex or another. And then to say that, well, you know, we're all just sort of gender fluid, and maybe I can be a man today and maybe a woman tomorrow, maybe a chipmunk the next day. All of this stuff is just preposterous nonsense. It flies in the face of all of the common sense truths that every society has based itself on. And you can't go on. You can't go on building a society on a foundation of lies. But to me, the original lie of American society was that the races are figments of our imaginations, or if not figments of our imagination, at least race is something that can be overcome, that races are all identical in terms of average ability and average temperament, and that all races are equally hardworking, equally intelligent, equally willing to work for the benefit of all. This is simply not true. And no one should even be tempted to believe it's true. There is no evidence to suggest that Blacks on average are as intelligent as East Asians. Why would anyone think such a thing? And yet that is dogma in the United States today. Not only is it dogma that they are as intelligent, but that even to notice the biological and physical differences is to commit some kind of act of aggression against people of different races. No, it would have been impossible for my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation to imagine such a march of folly.
Yeah, well, it's incredible what they can achieve nowadays with the power of ideologies, and because, you know, it's all based on that Marxist thing again, you know, trying to force equality no matter what. And once people start seeing things that way, they find it very hard to accept. They feel that they're a bad person for not looking at everybody as equal, and I think it's down to psychology, I think.
Well, I call it equality über alles, and yes, Everything is to be equal. The sexes are equal and interchangeable. Cultures are equal and interchangeable. All religions are equally beautiful and true. All peoples, everything, it's all just equality, equality, equality. Whereas just the slightest inspection tells us that the people of New Guinea have contributed practically nothing to world culture, whereas the French or the Japanese have contributed wonderful and remarkable things. But no, everyone is equal. It really is, it's a form of religion because it is a belief in things that are palpably untrue. And it's a belief that's based on wishful thinking rather than any kind of test against reality.
Well, as we come towards the end here, Jared, I know you've been, people are aware of the work that you do, and you're regarded as, a great voice for cutting through all the bullshit and talking about this issue in a kind of an unbalanced, balanced way. And of course, you had a surprise recently, didn't you, when you arrived in Zurich, I believe? Tell us about that.
Yes, I was changing planes in Zurich with the expectation of flying on to Stockholm and then later to traveling to Finland to attend conferences in both those countries. But I was turned back by the Swiss border guards. They informed me that I was banned from the entire Schengen area by order of the Poles. Now, they had no idea what the Polish government might have against me, but because Switzerland is a member of the Schengen group, they had to conform to this Polish order. And so, yes, I was put on an airplane and sent right back to the United States, therefore missing out on the two conferences that I'd hoped to attend. Ironically, one of the conferences was devoted to the theme of anarcho-tyranny. And anarcho-tyranny is a concept that was conceived of by my dear friend Sam Francis, who died in 2005. But anarchy means that the criminals get away with anything, and the tyranny is that law-abiding people are tyrannized by our governments. And here is a perfect example. Here is Europe, which welcomes ISIS fighters and absolute vipers that hate it, welcomes such people to its bosom, and then expels someone like me who loves Europe and who's really devoted my life to trying to preserve Europe. Here is, there are all kinds of criminals that are led across the border. People come in illegally with absolutely no papers at all, seeking asylum, and then they go on to rape the inhabitants and desecrate their churches. That's okay, but that's the kind of anarchy that our society permits, whereas someone like me, no criminal record whatsoever, with the best of intentions for Europe, I am a subject of this kind of tyranny and not even allowed to enter the 26-member Schengen group.
Wow, because they're obviously, like I said, you've got a reputation for having the views you have, and they probably, they were on alert. They knew you were probably knew you were coming, knew about the event, or at least had you on some sort of a watch list, and then they took action.
Well, no, it's the Poles. The Poles had no idea that I was going to be heading towards Zurich, but they had simply put out this alert, this ban on me, and they have simply said that for 3 years, I cannot enter without a visa the Schengen area, which ordinarily Americans have the right to do. Now, they did not have the decency to inform me ahead of time that they put a Schengen ban on me, and so it was only showing up within the territory that I was bounced unceremoniously. And even then, since that time, I've been trying to contact Polish authorities, both here in the United States and in Poland, and also in Switzerland, which is where the actual banning took place. And I've gotten no response whatsoever, no explanation. What is it that I've done? What is it the Poles don't like about what I did? But there you have it. For 3 years, I'm banned from the Schengen group. Although I understand that I can apply for individual visas from Schengen group countries, and it may be that I can go to countries if I am able to get visas for them specifically, but from within those countries, I'm not allowed to travel to any other Schengen group country.
Is this the most extreme example then of censorship or anything you've had to deal with?
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I've been banned from the United Kingdom. Theresa May, back when she was Home Secretary, at least she had the courtesy to send me a letter beforehand saying, we think that you are likely to cause racial conflict in the United Kingdom, and so we will not allow you in. So that is really the land of my ancestry. It's really a blow to be kept from the land that my culture, my language, all of these things originated. My ancestors came from there, but no, I'm not allowed in. That was really a shock. Also, and it happens all the time, I used to have a Twitter account. Twitter has silenced me. I used to have a Facebook account. Facebook has silenced me. I used to sell my books on Amazon. Amazon recently ceased to sell my books. So no, we face a tremendous amount of censorship. Censorship of ideas that, as I say, up until 67 years ago, were absolutely taken for granted by practically every white person on earth. So we do live in astonishing times in which orthodoxy, which is guarded by these people who seem to have a belief in miracles, who seem to believe in things that are palpably untrue, but they have power, and they are so terrified of people like me who point out the stupidity and ultimate folly and the suicidal nature of what they're saying, that they don't even dare to try to refute people like me or like you. They prefer to silence us. It's really the most graceless way of admitting they've lost the argument, if instead of explaining why we are wrong, they simply muzzle us. But every orthodoxy, as it dies, lashes out in the most vicious way. And I see a great deal of evidence that this orthodoxy is dying, and it is lashing out, but it will certainly die someday.
Yeah, well, maybe there's a way of taking it as an indirect compliment, inconvenient as it is and irritating as it is. I think they're afraid of people listening to what you have to say. And on that note, Jared, I think it's been great talking to you and hearing your thoughts about things. And I look forward to watching more of your interviews and more of the articles on the amrem.com website, and I'll have the link for that in the description as well.
If you don't mind, perhaps you could add the link to our YouTube channel. We have more than 100,000 subscribers, but we always feel as though we are hanging by a spider's thread. YouTube could very well decide that what I say is intolerable and so vile it simply can't be refuted and must be silenced. So, but at least for the time being, that seems to be something that people like, is the videos that we make. We also have a podcast channel at Amren Podcast. That's also on YouTube. But thank you very much for inviting me, and I wish you every success in all your ventures, and I hope that Ireland can stay Irish forever.
Well said, Jared. Jared Taylor, thank you very much for your time today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for watching Resolving Reality. That was author and editor of the American Renaissance website, Jared Taylor. For more information and articles, visit the American Renaissance website, amren.com, and also check out their YouTube channel, and the links for those will be in the description. Support Resolving Reality, hit those like and subscribe buttons, and make sure you check out the Resolving Reality Radio podcast episodes as well. For all our other profiles and platforms, visit our website, resolvingreality.com. So once again, thanks for watching. Until next time, and enjoy Resolving Reality.